Welcome to the Chronological Christie podcast, in which a long-time Agatha Christie collector and her Christie novice husband discuss the works of the Queen of Crime in publication order. In this episode, we take a look at Agatha Christie's second novel and the introduction of Tommy and Tuppence in The Secret Adversary.
Welcome to the Chronological Christie podcast. We are your hosts.
Gillian Porter, a long-time Agatha Christie reader and collector.
And her husband, Alan Porter, who after almost 40 years of sharing a house with Agatha Christie books, has decided that he should read them.
We'll be tackling the books in UK publication order as detailed on the official Agatha Christie website, and sharing our thoughts on each from the viewpoint of someone familiar with them
and someone reading them for the first time.
In this episode, we will be taking a look at The Secret Adversary, which was published in 1922 and earned her £50, approximately equivalent to £3,400 in 2023.
Before we dive into the book itself, we thought it would be interesting to place it into context of what was happening in the UK and the world at large at that time. So what was going on in the UK in 1922? Well, the year begins as the British Empire is at its largest extent of any empire in history, covering 1/4 of the world, 33 million square miles, and ruling over 1 in 4 people on the earth, a population of 423 million people. See, I would have thought that was the Victorian age, but apparently it was 1922. So maybe...
I know, I was thinking exactly the same thing. That's very interesting.
That same year, the British Broadcasting Company, or the BBC as you probably know it, was formed and began radio broadcasts. The Irish Civil War began, where the Irish National Army, using artillery loaned by the British, began to bombard the anti-treaty Irish Republican Army forces that were occupying courts in Dublin at the time. It was the year of the discovery of the tomb of Tutankhamun in Egypt by English archaeologist Howard Carter. And I'm sure we'll be coming back to archaeology at some point as this podcast series continues.
Definitely.
And what about what was happening in the rest of the world? It was 1922 was the year that there was the first successful insulin treatment of diabetes, and that was in Toronto in Canada. The silent horror film Nosferatu premiered at the Berlin Zoological Garden in Germany, which is interesting because the current version of Nosferatu is in the cinemas as we record this. Joseph Stalin was appointed General Secretary of the Central Committee of the Soviet Communist Party. Hollywood Bowl open-air music venue opened, which is pretty cool because Jill and I were lucky enough to go to a concert there a couple of years ago. It was the year of the start of hyperinflation in Germany. And in Italy, the March on Rome brought the National Fascist Party and Benito Mussolini to power.
And what was going on with Agatha? What was happening in her life in 1922? Archie suggested she write another book, but she had been disappointed in her earnings. She only earned money from the sale of the serial rights of her debut novel, The Mysterious Affair at Styles, to the weekly magazine. But Archie encouraged her to carry on writing as the publishers had made money, so they should be happy to accept another book. But she really didn't know what to write. This is a series of quotes from the Agatha Christie, an autobiography, which is a wonderful book. If you've never read it, I suggest you go out and buy it, or borrow it from the library and read it. It is a fabulous book. She says, "The question was solved for me one day when I was having tea in an ABC. An ABC was a chain of cafes in the UK at the time. They had reasonably priced tea, cups of tea and meals." And she continues, "2 people were talking at a table nearby discussing somebody called Jane Fish. It struck me as the most entertaining name." Then later she quotes, "I thought it could make a good beginning to a story, a name overheard in a tea shop, an unusual name." Then later on she quotes again, "I settled for Jane Finn and started writing straight away. I called it The Joyful Adventure first, then The Young Adventurers, and finally it became The Secret Adversary." Also in 1922, the Christies joined an around-the-world promotional tour from the British Empire exhibition, which was led by Major Ernest Belcher. They left their daughter with Agatha's mother and her sister, and in the 10 months they were away, they travelled to South Africa, Australia, New Zealand, Hawaii, and Canada. They learned to surf prone in South Africa. Then in Waikiki, they were among the first Britons to surf standing up and extended their time there by 3 months to practice because they enjoyed it so much.
That must be nice. I was just going to stay in Hawaii for an extra 3 months.
I know, right?
Surfing. What a different life.
But then if you read in her memories, because there is a book about that tour as well, which is also excellent, by the way, then they're constantly worrying about money while they're gone too, because all of Archie's costs were covered because he was actually working on the British Empire exhibition. But Agatha wasn't. She wasn't being paid. And by the time they left Hawaii, they'd almost run out of money, and she barely had anything to eat while they were in Canada. While they extended their time there, I don't think it did their finances any good in the long run.
Oh, okay. I think you just answered my question. I was going to say how come they were on the tour in the first place, but you said Archie Christie was actually working as part of the team, yes?
Yes, he was, yes.
Okay. So she was a tag-along.
Yes, definitely, yes.
Okay. Interesting backstory. Love the stuff about the surfing. You don't really think about people surfing, certainly English people surfing in the 1920s.
No, you don't. No, especially, when you picture the pictures of Agatha Christie as when she was older, that someone like that would enjoy surfing. But you have to remember they were pretty young at this point.
You just always picture them in long dresses and stuff, but I guess it was the 1920s, flappers, they were young. We just have these preconceived ideas, don't we, about what older generations did, and it's always like, oh yeah, they were just as hip and fun as
we were. We are.
As any we were, and as our kids are, and as our kids are. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, we're still hip and trendy.
Well, yeah, that's true. Yeah. Let's talk about the book. On this podcast, we are talking about plots and stories that range from 50 to just over 100 years old. And in several cases, they have been adapted for TV, radio, and movies. But as this podcast demonstrates, people are coming new to the works of Agatha Christie at any time and may not be familiar with all the details of the stories under discussion. So this is a spoiler warning that we are going to dive into the plot and character details, as well as talking about who done it and why. So if you aren't familiar with the story under discussion, you might want to pause the podcast here, find a copy of the book we're talking about, give it a read before returning for the discussion. Or you can just keep listening whether you know the story or not. It's your choice. But with that said, let's dive into The Secret Adversary.
This is a very brief plot synopsis. If you want a deeper one, you can find one on Wikipedia, and the link to that will be in our show notes. So the Great War, which is World War I, is over and jobs are scarce. They're scarce whether you're a man returning from the war or a woman who'd been working during the war. Everybody was having trouble finding jobs. Tommy Beresford and Prudence Tuppence Cowley, who were friends before the war, run into each other in London and discover they are both equally short of money and opportunities. On a whim, while they are in a tea shop, they decide to start a business and advertise themselves as the young adventurers. No unreasonable offer refused. They soon find themselves embroiled in a search for a missing woman and a lost treaty while trying to work out who their mysterious foe is.
So yeah, we're going to start talking about the plot first. It was not what I was expecting after reading Poirot last time out for obviously my first Christie book. This felt like it was written by a completely different author. It was less of a whodunit and more of a who is it, as the reader tried to figure out who the mysterious mastermind behind the gang of criminals is. So I was surprised to find I was reading a light, fast-paced thriller, and it drew me right in from the start. I loved the prologue around the sinking of the Lusitania in 1915. I thought it was a great way to kick things off, but I'm a sucker for fiction tied into historical events because that's largely what I write with my fiction, so I guess it just pulled me in. I like this idea of this mysterious Mr. Brown. I love the idea of, I don't know whether she's the first one to do it, but I thought it was really clever. Not even the people in his own organization really knew who the leader, Mr. Brown, was, that he could be anybody. They didn't even know if he was in a meeting. It's not like he walked in and said, like Blofeld or whatever, I'm number one, or I'm the head of this organization. He could be the guy stood in the corner. He could be the guy serving the tea. At one point, he seems to be acting as a clerk in an office and basically, surreptitiously stops something happening by walking in and saying, oh, you've got a meeting, you need to, or you've got a phone call or whatever. I just love this idea that nobody knew who he was. Nobody knew how to describe him. He was just an ordinary guy. The name Brown was a fairly ordinary name. Yeah, just this idea that even within his own organization, there was this mystery around him, I thought was a brilliant idea. I think plot-wise, my only sort of slight downtime, and we've talked about this before we got on the podcast, but I do find it odd at times that Tommy and Tuppence would disappear from the narrative for extended stretches of time. There was a time when Tommy wasn't in the story for quite a stretch of time, then he sort of comes back, and then we get a stretch where Tuppence is in it for a long time. And in both cases, they've been caught by the bad guys or whatever. But the other person seems, from today's perspective, fairly blasé about the fact that somebody's been missing for a week or just over a week. And I think that might be just a reflection of the times. Today we're all connected all the time. And if you don't hear from somebody for a day, then when you're expecting to, you start to get worried. I guess things move slower, communications were slower. So not hearing from somebody for a couple of days or 3 days might seem, or even a week may not seem that far out. But it just seemed odd to me that on the surface, they didn't appear to care that the other person was missing for that length of time. But the more we talked about it, I think that's me projecting today's expectation onto 1920s pace of life, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. But I just, as we've discussed it before, I don't actually agree with you, because when Tommy disappears, Tuppence and Julius are quite anxious as to where he is. And she does write to Mr. Carter, who basically, I would say he was the callous one, but then he's, he works in the world where people disappear. He was like, oh, well, when you came to work for me, we did agree you were on your own. And if something happens, it happens. But she was anxious about it. But then there are also the jolly moments they have. I would say the thing I find hardest was just how quickly they buddied up with Julius. I enjoy the parts where, because they'd been so short of money and hungry a lot of the time, the idea of when they first get money is, we're not just going to go to a cheap place and have a good meal. We're going to the Ritz. I thought that was funny, because neither of them come from that kind of money to think that going to the Ritz was normal before the war. Tuppence is the youngest daughter of a fairly impoverished local vicar. So I liked those bits. I did find it for me hard to reread, because I knew what was happening. I knew who the baddie was. I kind of wished, like you were coming in the first time, because I know the first time I read it, like you, it was fun. It was fast paced, wanted me to keep turning the pages. But I found it a little bit harder because I knew what was coming. Occasionally wanted to smack either Tommy or Tuppence for being so stupid as to who they trusted and who they talked to. But then they were young, and even though they both had experiences in the war, both seemed relatively naive in the way she wrote them. So I guess, if somebody says they're trustworthy, you trust them. But that was my main issue. I found that hard to deal with, that they were like, oh, we're just going to trust anybody just because he says he's trustworthy or whatever. So, but again, it's very fun, maybe a bit too much dashing here or there for my liking, but it does fit in with the pace. Julius
was the American millionaire who was also looking for the missing girl, because she was his cousin. That's right. That's who you meant in terms of trusting Julius so quickly.
Yes.
Yeah. And Mr. Carter was the head of the Secret Service who basically employed them.
Well, yeah. Assume he's the head of the Secret Service, because they never actually say so.
Yeah, he's secret about who he actually is and what he's actually working for. And you mentioned the zooming around. So, the next thing we have on our list to talk about is the settings. I actually loved the fact that the plot moved around a lot of different locations this time. And this time I actually got a good sense of where they were. And I think that's because last time it was a fictional house in a fictional village in a fictional city. This time, it was very clearly an English thing. I mean, a lot of the action was set in London, very specific places. You know, we mentioned that the Ritz Hotel, there was other places that they mentioned, like areas of Soho or particular tea rooms that I've, either know where they are or been in them or read about them in, over the years. They went to places like Bournemouth and they went up to Yorkshire. They went to, Manchester. They went out to sort of Holyhead and parts of Kent. So it was very specific. There was a lot of moving around, but every time they moved around, it was to somewhere that I knew or knew of, so could picture it. I liked that with this one. I think I preferred it being set in an England that I could relate to.
Yeah, I can understand that. I agree with you. I think having been to some of those places, it does help. I'd be curious if any of our listeners who've never been, how they felt about the descriptions of the areas, whether they thought that it came to life, because I'm also aware that growing up in the UK, we have been to London several times. If you've never been, or you've never been to Bournemouth or Yorkshire or Manchester or Kent, whether you were able to pull up those visions in your head. I mean, the internet's out there, so you can always take a look, I guess. But I'm just curious if any of you listening have any opinions on how realistic you felt it was. But again, they were written very vaguely, like in the first one. There wasn't really a lot of description about any of them. But there is the expectation, like, even, I don't know whether it's, again, growing up in England or books you read or pictures you've seen, but like the Ritz and Claridge's are going to be sumptuous, they're going to be comfortable, the food's going to be good. So you can put those things in your mind because they're kind of world famous for being expensive, luxurious places.
This was very much a British book written for a British audience at the time. I mean, so again, I think there's that sort of underlying assumption that she can just use place names and you have a picture in your mind or you'll know of them at least.
Right, yeah.
Was there anything in her autobiography or any of the books you've read about why she switched from using fictional places in the first book to actual ones? Or is that a Poirot's in a fictional world and Tommy and Tuppence is in a real world type thing?
No, I don't think so, because a lot of the later Poirot books are in very specific places. And for her, Styles may have been a very specific place. I can't remember, and I'm obviously failing as a longtime collector and fan here, whether she used a specific place. Because, I mean, she'd grown up in a kind of big fancy house. She may well have visited something that is like this. I'll have to do some research from her autobiography, see if I can find that information out for you.
But then again, as we go forward, I guess Miss Marple, just from knowing it from TV and movies, is in a fictional village. So I guess there may not be like a formula for it. It's just whatever she felt served the story, I guess. But
I think so, yeah.
Now I know my way around the UK. And we went there with Tommy and Tuppence. What do we think about the characters of Tommy and Tuppence?
Well, as you read it for the first time, I think you should go first.
I thought they were delightful, pretty much from the first page that you encounter them on. They just sounded like a fun young couple, sort of in some ways reminded some of our daughter's friends when they were around 20 or, early 20s, with a life ahead of them. And obviously they've just been through a lot of trauma with the war, but they sort of, getting over that by, if you like, going completely the other way and being lighthearted and maybe overemphasizing the lightheartedness and trying to bury the trauma by being fun. I loved them right from the start. I thought they were fresh, they were fun. Just trying to find their way in the world, but not having a real idea of where it was, reacting to things that come to them. I thought Christie had a much better grasp of dialogue in this one. I mean, you really got to know these two characters and a lot of the others too, not just the lead characters, through their dialogue. I thought she really used dialogue a lot better here in terms of developing all the characters. I had that thing last time about there was only really two characters she developed. I think here you got to know most of the characters and certainly the important ones much better in this.
I agree with you. Yeah, I found that too. Yes.
I loved the lift attendant, Albert, the movie fan. I thought he was fun. I hope we get to see more of him going forward, which I understand we do. And I would love to learn more about the mysterious Mr. Carter, who may or may not have worked for British intelligence. I don't know whether he reappears, but I thought he was quite an interesting character as well. The other one, and I think this has come up more because of the adaptations we watched, we'll talk about later, but Rita Vandermeer I thought was an interesting, the mysterious Rita who may or may not have been part of the criminal organization in some aspects, I thought she was quite interesting too. So I found a lot more people in this that I related to, wanted to know more about. I thought the character development was a lot better done in this one than it was in the previous one.
Yeah, I mean, you've already said, I told you Albert is going to be an ongoing character. He's my favorite character out of all of them. He tends to keep it a little bit grounded when they go off into flights. But I agree with you. It was much more, the characters were much more fleshed out in this. The conversations between Tommy and Tuppence were delightful, as you said. I really enjoyed them. Their joy hadn't been dimmed by the war, and their enthusiasm for life was still there. And I really liked that. Yeah, I thought the characters were all great. They all had personalities. They weren't just flat. And I thought that was really good. So let's talk about that dreaded word of yours, the denouement.
The denouement. See, I've been practicing.
Yeah, there you go. Well done.
So having read it and looked at reviews and things online, the thing of, and even the contemporary reviews were, it was a big secret until right at the very end who the bad guy was. And I'm like, I actually clocked who the mysterious Mr. Brown was, I think, pretty much as soon as he appeared in the story. So spoiler alert if you haven't read it, that Mr. Brown was the posh lawyer politician Sir James Peel Egerton. Awesome name. Or at least I thought I did when he first appeared, but then the excellent misdirection that Christie is so good at started, and I began to second guess myself. And the more it went on, the more convinced I was that he was the bad guy. And you mentioned it earlier. I started to get a little frustrated with Tommy and Tuppence that they weren't picking up on clues, and they were telling him stuff. And I'm like, why are you telling him that? Why are you trusting him? Why are you asking him to do that? It's pretty obvious that even if he's not the bad guy, he's connected to the bad guys in some way. That he's the lead. He's the guy who's setting things up, or at least spilling the secrets. But I will say it didn't spoil the story for me. So the big reveal wasn't a surprise, so I guess it felt a little less satisfying, but it didn't really spoil the book for me. I still really enjoyed the book.
Well, good. I did too, but from a different perspective, having read it a couple of times before. But I was also going to say about Tommy and Tuppence, they were young and inexperienced at this kind of stuff. Plus also, Mr. Carter trusted Sir James Peel Egerton. He was a friend of his. They had dinner together. So why wouldn't they trust somebody that Mr. Carter trusts? Because he's experienced in the espionage world. And if he thinks he's a good guy, then they would too. But I also got a bit frustrated because obviously I knew he was a baddie when he kept telling him things and things kept happening that confused them. I did like the misdirection that it was going to be Julius Hersheimer, if that's how you say his name, the rich American that was looking for his cousin Jane. The way that he built that up by casually saying, can you find out for me about the body that was found in the New York docks, and insinuating that he wasn't the real man and that he was a baddie, probably Mr. Brown. But then I thought, in the book, they also said Mr. Brown wasn't a foreigner. Americans are foreigners. So I thought that was a bit of a stretch, but clever that he was slipping in those things. I thought the denouement was good for me because he didn't get a chance to pontificate too much. And I get fed up when the baddie gets feels like a 3-hour session where he can sit down and tell everybody about his thing. But he got his piece out and, it was relatively short. And I appreciated that because sometimes it can be a bit tedious when you're reading it and you're, yeah, we know. It was a satisfying denouement for me.
Yeah, you're not a fan of the monologuing villain, are you?
No, not at all.
Talking of sort of storytelling techniques, let's talk about the writing. I mentioned this earlier on. If I didn't know that this and The Mysterious Avera Styles had been written by the same person, I wouldn't have guessed. It felt so completely different in tone and approach. This was much lighter, faster paced. I found it difficult to put down at times. I was really pulled into the search for the missing girl, Jane Finn, where the all-important treaty papers were. I also liked the fact that the papers were a total MacGuffin, and we actually never found out what was so important about the treaty in terms of what was written on it and why it was going to be bad for England. I
know. Yeah, I love that. I absolutely love that because it doesn't matter at the end of the day. And I thought that was a really fun twist.
Yeah, I mean, it was a story about the people and the adventure. It wasn't about the thing. And I really did like that. Like we talked last time, there's a lot of cultural shorthand assumptions in. I'm not sure how many of today's readers know what a Bradshaw's is. By the way, it's a book of railway timetables. there's several places where you go, oh, I looked at Bradshaw's, and it's like, well, if you don't know what that is, it may not make sense. Again, I think there's some cultural assumptions, there's some geographical assumptions, but again, it was a book written for the British audience in 1922, when a lot of those contemporary references would be understood by those initial readers. And it also actually made me go look up a couple of things, which is always interesting. Like I say, I found it interesting that she did weave the plot around what was going on politically and the cultural uncertainty at the time with the rise of socialism. But it doesn't feel dated in any way, which was interesting. It's very much a story of its time, but it's timeless as well, which I found really fascinating.
Yeah, no, I agree with you. I felt, it could apply to any time at any stage, because there's always some level of uncertainty going on. I thought it was light and breezy. It really reflected Tommy and Tuppence's characters, very different from her first book. For anybody else, there was the ABC cafes, but there's also the ABC railway timetables as well as the Bradshaws. So it can get a bit confusing, and I understand what you're saying, but I don't think she expected at that time that her books were going to be, 100 years later, just as popular as they were then, or even more popular. I mean, you go in any, our local big chain, Barnes and Noble, they've always got a large selection. You go into most biggish independent stores, they'll have copies of a couple of them. I know during the pandemic, places like Half Price Books in some states or any secondhand bookstore couldn't keep them in stock because people were just desperate to read something that was interesting, made them think, but I think wasn't too threatening of the times.
Yeah, no way that she wrote them thinking in 100 years' time, two idiots are going to be sat here doing not that she would have known what a podcast was, a radio show.
Talking about how wonderful her books are. Yeah,
talking about the experience of reading a book. We all do it when we write. We all put in contemporary references. It's difficult not to do it, as we write what we know, and she definitely does write what she knows at the time. So
yeah, exactly.
Like I said, it makes it interesting because it's like, when she does some of those references, it's like a Bradshaw's. Okay, I knew what a Bradshaw's was. It was okay, but there was other ones. Like when you said about the ABC tea rooms, I was like, well, I know about Lyons tea rooms, but what's an ABC tea room? So there's always things even now that picking up and like, okay, what is that? What's she referring to?
Oh yeah, I agree with you. Is there any other things that come outside of the labels we've discussed? Anything else you would like to talk about?
Yeah, I want to talk about Inspector Japp. I found it interesting that Inspector Japp here is mentioned as an off-stage character. He's never actually in the story. They just mention his name as a police inspector who's on the phone talking to Jules Hersheimer, to get that right. Basically talking to on the phone about his missing cousin, and then Japp never appears in the story. So it made me wonder why she chose Inspector Japp. That could have been Inspector Smith, Inspector Jones, Inspector, I don't know, whatever, any other name. But by using Japp, was that a deliberate attempt to link this to the Poirot stories? I mean, do they sort of coexist in a Christie-verse type thing?
Not from my memory, no. I don't remember that at all. And it is interesting that she uses his name, probably because she used it in The Mysterious Affair at Styles and was maybe at that point looking for continuity between the world she was creating. But I have no memory of him really being mentioned again.
Or it could be she just thought it was a throwaway name she'd already used, so why not use it again? Yeah. So no Christie universe crossovers and... No.
Okay. Much to a lot of people's disappointment, I think. I think there is a lot of talk out there about how there should have been. Let's talk about the adaptations and what were they and what did we think of them?
Okay, it seems there was quite a few for this one, which surprised me.
The first one, the book was adapted by London Weekend Television as a 115-minute drama and transmitted on Sunday, the 9th of October, 1983, with James Warwick as Tommy and Francesca Annis as Tuppence and Rhys Dinsdale as Albert.
I really liked this. I thought it was a good, fun adaptation. It really respected the source material. The two leads were older than they are in the book, but they still made a very engaging, fun couple. You could believe them as a couple. You could believe the interchange. from the plot point of view, they followed it really well. I mean, they made a few small changes, dropped some of the subplots. And again, like we talked about with the prior one last time, I think that made it tighter. And there was some dialogue changes, but they were logical dialogue changes in who they had somebody else speaking somebody else's lines occasionally, but they worked with the story. They worked in service of the story. So I really enjoyed this one. I thought it was a really good, fun adaptation. Quite happy to watch that one again over and over. Yeah.
Oh, yeah, me too. I agree. They made a great couple. They had great chemistry. It was well paced. The interaction between Albert and the hotel gopher Henry were quite funny too. I did enjoy that. The only thing I found annoying was the thing they decided to write in there, which I only think was in the book a couple of times, was Tuppence constantly getting Albert and Henry's names wrong. I didn't find it funny. I found it tedious and thoughtless. It gave Tuppence a kind of personality trait that I didn't care for, hadn't read in the book, and given her that forgetful side or whatever. I just didn't appreciate that. I thought it took away from the scenes with them, which were quite delightful. So I was a bit disappointed in that, but in general, I thought it was great. I thought everybody who was in it played their parts well. It flowed well, and it seemed really fast. It didn't seem like it was almost 2 hours.
No, it did fly by, didn't it?
Yeah.
I sort of agree with you with the forgetful name thing, because they did it once, which I think in the book she does it like when she first meets Albert, she calls him by a different name and he's like, no, my name's Albert. She makes an assumption what his name is. They obviously picked that up and thought, oh, well, we'll keep doing that throughout. And yeah, it did drag a little bit. It became a bit unnecessary.
But it's insulting. It's insulting to Albert and Henry, because they're people in the story. They become important figures in the story of the adaptation. To do that, I thought was, unnecessarily sidelining them a little bit and their importance.
But it didn't really distract from the adaptation overall.
No, not in general, no.
BBC also adapted The Secret Adversary, maybe, in July and August 2015 as part of the 125th anniversary of Dame Agatha Christie's birth. They moved it. This was moved from the 1920s to the 1950s. And Tommy and Tuppence are not the bright young things, but are actually an older married couple with a son off at boarding school. And it's set in 1952. Where do I start on this? I think the first thing I sort of wrote in our script was so many changes that any resemblance to the actual plot from the book is coincidental. I don't know what this was, but it wasn't The Secret Adversary. Okay, it was about them looking for a lost MacGuffin. It had characters with the same names on the whole. And there was a couple of the plot points in there. And this was a 3 1-hour episodes. And boy, it dragged. And characters were so off-model. Tommy and Tuppence, I didn't believe them as a couple at all. Tommy was played largely as an idiot. It made you wonder why Tuppence was even married to him in the first place. There was little bits towards the end where there was some chemistry, but there was no real chemistry between the two. I don't know. I really did. You probably can guess. I really didn't like it.
I didn't either. If we hadn't have been doing this podcast and felt we needed to watch it, I would have turned it off. They made Mr. Carter seem like a bumbling fool, which is very unbelievable. He works for the Secret Service. He's going to be sharp and intelligent. I liked what they did with Albert. I thought he was funny and clever. Thought he was very underutilized because he was the only bright point in any of it. Was very glad when it ended. They were so busy making changes, they seemed to forget to craft a coherent story, and they took all the joy out of the book and the original adaptation. It just wasn't believable. None of it made sense, and there was no reason why they got involved in the first place.
Yeah, it was very dark, wasn't it?
It was dark. The book has so much hope and joy in it, because Tommy and Tuppence believe in good. They believe in good overcoming evil. And this one was just a mess. I didn't really care what was going to happen to anybody. Whereas I did with the book and I did with the first adaptation.
I will say the one thing for me I'm going back was Rita Vandermeer in this was played by Alice Krige as a opera singer diva. They changed the end of her story arc, but I thought she played that part with what she was given really well, as opposed to on the other one where I really liked the adaptation, but Rita was played by Honor Blackman. who I normally really love, but I felt was very flat and didn't really come over that well in the other adaptation, even though it was a good adaptation. So I think I think the Rita in the bad adaptation was better than the Rita in the good adaptation, if that makes sense.
Agreed. But it also depends on what direction Honor Blackman was given. Okay, so the next adaptation is a graphic novel that was released by HarperCollins on May 20th in 2008. It was adapted by Francois Rivière, and if I mispronounce any of these names, I apologize profusely. And it was illustrated by Frank Leclerc. This was translated from the edition first published in France by Emmanuel Proust in editions in 2003 under the title of Mr. Brown. I was so excited when I found out that there were a series of graphic novels of the books. We both read and enjoy graphic novels. And I really didn't care for this at all. I thought the artwork and the coloring were awful. All the characters seemed to look slightly cross to me, and the artwork and the coloring were also not consistent on each page. Changed certain things in the story, which I didn't understand. Like in the book, it's Tuppence's idea to search the survivors list of the Lusitania when they were looking for Rita, but they turned it into Julius's. I didn't get that at all. The way the art was drawn, it was fairly obvious that Sir James Edgerton Peel was Mr. Brown because he had that typical wicked uncle look. I don't know if that was deliberate or whatever, but I think it spoilt the story for me. And on page 34, the most egregious one for me is they refer to Julius as Lucius. And there's no way that shouldn't have been caught during editing. And they changed a few other things which I can understand. And I will say, the drawing of Agatha Christie at the end of the book, I did like that. I just didn't care for the artwork. I ended up looking at that too much. And the story was, it missed bits that maybe should have been in there.
Yeah, like you, I was disappointed. Both, love comics and graphic novels. And I was really looking forward to this one. But it hit the main points of the plot, which the second TV adaptation didn't, but at least it was a bit more faithful that way, with a few changes. But I don't know, it didn't have that nuance of the original. It didn't have that sense of joy. You said the artwork was very, very flat. And I think it helped to have read the novel to fully understand what interactions were being depicted here. You had to know who certain people were and how important they were, I think, to really understand some of the exchanges. I say the artwork lacked depth, and at times it was difficult to tell people apart. And there were certain characters who had no impact on the plot, who were literally background characters that they put in the foreground of certain panels. So when I was reading it, I was like, oh, who is that? I wonder who that's going to turn out to be. And it turned out to be nobody. It was just a random character. I'm like, well, why put them in the foreground of the panel and have the main characters in the background? That sort of mixing of visual prominence at the time sort of threw me out of the story, because I started wondering who these other people were, and it turned out they were nobody, which was really weird. And like you said, the thing this story is famous for, we talked at the front, is how the mystery of the main villain's identity is kept secret right until the end. And as you said, pretty much as soon as he comes on the page here, you're like, oh, that's the bad guy. It's pretty obvious. There is one other adaptation that we did not look at. Turns out that The Secret Adversary was the second Christie work to be turned into a film. It was made in Germany in 1929. So that's pretty quick after the book came out. It was made by the Orplid Film Company and released in Germany on the 15th of February 1929 as The Adventurers Limited. And it was a silent movie which ran for 76 minutes. And it was also released in the UK and the US under the title Adventures Inc. But character names from the book were changed for the film. So it wasn't a Tommy and Tuppence story, but it was The Secret Adversary. I don't know if it still exists. It'd be fun to maybe see if it exists somewhere and try and find it. Any thoughts on the German movie, Jill?
No, just if we can ever find it, it might be fun to watch. Time now for my favorite quote from the stuff I was reading while I was researching. Agatha Christie is remembered by the Museum of British Surfing as having said about surfing, "Oh, it was heaven, nothing like rushing through the water at what seems to you a speed of about 200 miles an hour. It is one of the most perfect physical pleasures I have known."
Thanks for joining us for this episode of the Chronological Christie podcast. If you would like to leave a rating or a review on your favorite podcast platform, that would be great. And don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss out on future episodes. If you would like to discuss any aspect of this episode, you can message us on the Chronological Christie Instagram account, a link for which will be in the show notes. Or you can find us on social media. Jill, where can we find you?
You can find me on the Chronological Christie Instagram account, and I'm looking forward to meeting you there.
And I can be found on most social media platforms by searching for @AlanJPorter or via my author's website at alanjporter.com. And if you want to keep up with my various writing projects, you can sign up for my free weekly newsletter at alanjporter.substack.com.
The books discussed on this podcast could be found on a dedicated Chronological Christie section of our online bookstore at bookshop.org. The link will also be in the show notes. Please join us for our next episode where we'll be discussing The Murder on the Links. We look forward to you joining us.
The music used in this episode was extracted from the public domain recording of I'm Somebody's Somebody Now by the Giovenuti Orchestra. The Chronological Christie podcast is a production of Megrin Entertainment, a division of 4J's Group, LLC.